To be honest with you, I didn't know who he was as a kid. I really wasn't a movie buff, so we didn't go to the movies, so I wasn't exposed to his work. I think the first time I saw him was in oh shoot, I can't even think now. What's the name of the play that became the famous Raisin in the Sun, Lorraine Hansberry? And I don't remember if I saw it on television
Wait a minute.
or when I was vacuuming. But I just remember when I first saw Sidney, I was like, man, this guy's all over the place. He's jumping up on tables. He's just when I started acting, which was 23 years ago, 1975, that's when I started really looking at his work and studying him. Because again, there was nobody to look at that looked like me. I mean, you had, people who danced and women who cleaned other people's houses.
And sang.
And sang, exactly, and sang and things like that. But not, I was, we all were very serious actors. And there weren't a lot of serious black actors for us to emulate, to follow, to admire. There was Sidney, there was James Earl Jones on stage. That's what I remember.
Yeah.
It wasn't even like comparing his roles to other roles. It really, as far as I saw it, it wasn't anything else. Especially, like I said, once I became an actor, there wasn't anything else to look at. In 1975, maybe the Negro Ensemble Company was doing some stuff in theater, some of which was going to television, like River Niger and a couple of movies like Claudine, maybe. But there wasn't a whole lot that I remember, so-called black exploitation pictures. It's like you could be Sidney or Superfly. A lot of people wanted to be like Shaft. That was a big thing. Again, I'm talking about in the black community where I grew up. There was another actor, was it James Edwards? I think his name was.
Yeah.
Who was out there, and from what I hear, very outspoken and was sort of overlooked. There was another fine actor named Canada Lee, who Sidney worked with, and was a quite a beloved country. But I think society was ready for someone like him. And he was such a gentleman and a fine actor. I think that, and I'm not knocking him in any way, I think he was acceptable. I think he was accepted. I don't think he was a threat. Just like I don't think Jackie Robinson was a threat. I'm not talking about who the men were. I'm talking about how they were perceived by white society in America. They weren't threatening. They were nice, colored people. And, aside from his great talent, he was obviously very talented, very charismatic. He came along at a time where white people were willing to have a sexual, bleeding man on screen and would go to see him, One. I heard it many times in my career. Oh, you're the next Sidney Poitier. I said, that's the most racist thing I've ever heard in my life, because you're saying it can only be one person at a time. There was one 40 years ago, and now there's one now. And you can only be compared to one other person, and that person has to be black, and that's who you are. And we've decided what you are, what category, and see you later. That's who you are. I always resented that. Excuse me. At the same time, I was like, okay, I'll take it. Great actor. Wonderful human being. Positive person. Kind man. Very kind man.
Tell me the first time you walked up to him.
He won't remember, but I actually met Sidney at a bookstore below the Beverly Wilshire Hotel. It must have been about 1978, probably. First time I came to Los Angeles, I was studying up at the American Conservatory Theater up in San Francisco, and I came down here that spring to check out Hollywood. And I met him, and of course I ran in my car and got my picture and resume like any bad actor would do, green actor would do. And he was very much a gentleman, and no, I don't think now's the time for that. I can't accept that from you, but I think he told me where to call or where to send it, and you know, I was appropriately tripping over my own feet and scared, and you know, I think I let him know right away I was from Mount Vernon, and that he actually lived up the block, or I lived up the block from, you know, where he used to live. And I don't know what I said. I probably didn't make any sense. I probably did all my scenes and everything right there on the spot. I don't remember, but I just remember him sort of like, like, calm down, young man. And that's the first time I met him. Sidney's helped me a lot in my career. When I did a Soldier's Play in New York, I remember him coming backstage, and he talked to everybody. And I don't know how it ended up how I was alone, or people were leaving, or he came back, whatever the situation was, and I was about to go out. And he stopped me. He says, "You're good." You know, like, as only he could say it, you know, and that's all I needed. I was like, wow, you know, and he told me, you know, I needed to talk to him about things or ask him any questions, you know, to give him a call. 1985, late 85 or early 86, I was offered a terrible screenplay film that I just hated to do. I called it The Nigga They Couldn't Kill. It was this awful screenplay about this guy. I forgot what he was accused of rape. Of course, he was in the South. He raped this white woman. He didn't do it, but he was accused of it. And they were going to hang him or electrocute him or something, and they tried to electrocute him, and he didn't die. You know, it was supposed to be a comedy. And they tried to hang him, and then it started raining or something, and they had him. It just was just terrible. It was terrible. It was terrible. I called it The Nigga They Couldn't Kill. And I called Sidney. I said, they're dangling, you know, I don't know what it was, $100,000 or whatever at that time in front of me to do this. And I said, I'm ill. I'm sick. What should I do? And he said to me, he said, the first 2 or 3 or 4 pictures you make will determine how you are perceived in this industry and in this town, in Hollywood. And he says, if you don't feel good about it, then don't do it. Even if it means you have to starve or wait, or maybe never get another opportunity. He says, but the first 3 or 4 films you make will determine how you are perceived. And I had already done A Soldier's Story with Norman. And I had done a film with Sidney Lumet. I said, okay, it's 2 great directors, Norman Jewison and Sidney Lumet. Then this screenplay came along. So I turned it down because Sidney told me to. Well, he didn't tell me to, he just suggested. He left it to me. I turned it down. And about 6 months later, I got a part. I met another fine director named Richard Attenborough, and got a part in a movie called Cry Freedom, where I got my first Oscar nomination, and that was directly related to Sidney telling me to wait, to be patient, not to, you know, for him to think I had too much to offer to settle for something. And I tell that story and I pass it on now, because now I'm sort of in his shoes, and young kids come up to me or ask me advice, and I always pass that story on.
People talk about Sidney as the first, he's not an African American, he's a Bahamian American actor who crossed over to white audiences. What does that mean, and what value do you think that it had, first of all, socially?
Well, at the time, it didn't mean anything to me because I didn't know what crossing over meant. It wasn't a part of my existence, so it wasn't something pre-integration. It wasn't something to aspire to. It didn't mean anything to me to go across town, and, you know, there wasn't anything going on over there any better than what was going on in my own neighborhood. So that's something I heard of once I got to Hollywood, actually. Crossover appeal, and, you know, heard it in the music business or whatever. I don't even, I don't even like that term because somehow it suggests that you're better when white people like you or something, or you're acceptable. So I just do what I do, and whoever likes it likes. If they don't, they don't. Universal appeal, I guess you'd say. He had, and has. I think that's a testament to his charisma and his talent, He just had that thing, that energy, that charm. You couldn't keep your eyes off him. Like I said, when I watched that Raising in the Sun, I was like, who is this guy jumping up on the tables and Gamamutie or whatever he was saying. I just remember him dancing and moving, and I'd never seen anybody like that, Yeah, not an actor. I'd seen Sammy Davis Jr. move, on Ed Sullivan or wherever, the 1 or 2 times that we got to see Sammy Davis Jr. And, but when I saw Sidney, it was like, and once I became an actor, that was the biggest difference, because I never thought about being an actor. I wanted to be Jim Brown. Sidney was okay, but Jim Brown was the king to me, I mean, I didn't think about actors, or I wasn't exposed to that. It wasn't something that I even wanted, I didn't even think about it, but.
So what did make you think about it? What did turn you on to acting?
What turned me on to acting? I just kind of, in college, just started taking classes and started liking it, and, found that I liked being up there on stage.
Sidney said when he was working at the studios, in the 50s and 60s, the only other black guy.
Cleaning up. Yeah. It's still the case sometime now. Unfortunately, sometimes that's still the case.
What is?
There's still the case that you don't see that many black people on film crews. Yeah, that's been in my career. It's been that way. I made a point to change that. I bring a whole bunch of people with me, and I demand that others are hired.
What is the scene now where you're working in Hollywood? What's the change between when Sidney was the only one?
Well, that's probably the biggest change. He's not the only one. I think that there are more opportunities now. There more roles, I think, for African American men. I don't think as many for women. I think that's across the board, black or white. Obviously, it's nowhere near as tough as it was for him. Like he said, to come to work and just be so isolated, be the only one there, and also having to carry the weight of your people. I don't think any actor or actress has to do that anymore. I don't think I have to do that. There's enough of us it's been spread out. It's more accepted, I felt that even more maybe earlier in my career, but not as much now. You did? Well, it was, that question was posed when you do interviews, and people say, you're representing us well, and keep it up, and everybody loves you, and and you're the only actor still with your wife, or whatever they say, But I don't. I would imagine it was a tremendous. I don't know if it was a burden, but a responsibility for him.
The isolation.
Yeah, because he's the only guy. He's the only guy. He was the only one, really, on that level. Maybe Harry Belafonte in there. Again, entertainers, but straight actors, dramatic actors.
What was the year that he did all those movies, Mary Beth? 67?
67.
67, you were a baby.
Heat of the Night in 67.
He did Heat of the Night, he did To Serve with Love, and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, which is not my favorite. But anyway, right after that, there was an article. What was the guy's name?
Clifford Mason.
Clifford Mason. The Times asked this black guy to write an article about Sidney called, "What is it about Sidney Poitier that makes white people love him so much?" And it was really painful.
Mm.
It was a real stab
Mm-hmm.
back, and a tremendous pain until we, finally worked it through.
Mhm.
But why do you think that kind of criticism happens when somebody who is a decent man reaches the kind of level? About that kind of
I just think it. I just think that. Well, first of all, who did it? Whose newspaper was it? Whose magazine was
It
it?
was in the New York Times.
Right.
They had asked. The
Yeah,
New York
well.
Times had asked this writer.
Yeah, and they also edited. And he didn't write exactly everything he wanted. They were looking for a certain slant. I always say, who considered a source? If it was for the New York Times, then they had, maybe they were sick of Sidney and they knew how to get at him. I don't know. I never read the article, so I really don't know. But I sure know about divide and conquer. Well, it's real simple. Two black people, you tell one the other one did it, and tell the other one did it. And sit back and let them go at each other. So if that writer was a black writer, and maybe he did feel that way, maybe he didn't, that was obviously an angle that the paper was interested in, and one that they wanted to print. It was just a time where there were two, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King sort of gave us two strong sides of the fence to stand on. And I think everybody sort of got polarized, and you were either here or there, and it was easier to make a decision about where somebody was, and here's a guy who was very visible, a black man in America in the 60s who was very visible. He wasn't preaching the rhetoric of the Nation of Islam or Black Panthers, so was automatically categorized passive or, in the Martin Luther King vein, we know better now. Both of them met the same fate, yeah.
Both of them had the same.
That's right.
There's an interview with Sidney. He was not, I don't think he was much older than you. Where they asked him about his point of view as a black man, point of view as a black man. And he said, I'm so sick of being asked.
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel about that?
Well, because most, people who interview you are lazy. So they look for the obvious. People say that to me. I go, well, as a white female interviewer, how does it feel to ask me that question? Usually people don't think of that. Well, as a black man, how's it, I don't know. As a Canadian director, if you start thinking about it that way, it gets ridiculous. Well, as a white male from North Dakota, tell me about, like that's a point of view that all people of that color or from that place have about a certain situation. So, usually just lazy reporters.
What's still left to be done?
About what? For me at this point, I just, as an actor, filmmaker, I just want to, has to be things that interest me, that I have a passion about. What's left to be done? Where you want to start? I don't think it's the job, number one, of the film industry, or, there's just so much to be done. You look around, turn the idiot box on, and see what fools we're making of ourselves, inside and outside of the Beltway, and travel all around the world, and we're sort of the laughing stock of the world. People are like, what are you guys doing over there? it's like we're childish, you know. But it's good, you know. It's like it's all it's that what's that saying? It all comes out in the wash, you know. The, I don't know. The whole political scene is just ridiculous. But
You think it's ridiculous what's going on in Washington, really?
oh yeah, I think it's I don't really even think about it, you know. I mean, I just the only thing that concerns me is this: is that people have to understand that those folks in Washington don't need 90% of the people to vote. They just need more than 50% of the vote. So if they turn everybody in America off and only 5,000 people vote, doesn't matter to them. They're still their policy's still gonna affect 200 or 300 million people. So I think it's important for people to realize that their vote is important and that they need to stay involved even while we're wallowing through this nonsense. They need to not, you know, disengage, because all they need to do is win. They don't need hundreds of millions of people to vote. Like I said, if 5,000 vote, they're all happy as long as they get 51% of that 5,000. But once they're in position of power, they can affect how many of there are of us in America now, 250 million or whatever.
That's right, and
Yeah.
it's going down every year.
Yeah, of course. Why wouldn't it? Who the heck's going to run for office now? You know,
That's right.
who's going to run for office? Somebody who's never done anything? Come on, who's that guy?
Who wants to?
Yeah, who wants that? That's like the boy. Yeah, who's, you know, gotta be careful, man. You know, Hitler got voted in, right?
That's right.
Gotta be real careful. This is a tricky time right now, because somebody can slip in there that can really be dangerous. And what's that got to do with Sydney?
Well, okay, looking over the last 50 years, what would you say is Sydney's place historically in film?
Well, he's a pioneer. You know, we all, he's like the point man, you know, he's the car that's out front. And we all sort of been riding in his draft, you know. So, you know, the African American performers that have come since him, actors, dramatic actors, if you will, we're all riding in his draft, still. You know, I know he pulled me along, you know, and set an example. You know, he set the standard. Take it or leave it, like him or not. You know, and the standard is high. You know, he represents integrity and quality. You know, he's a gentleman. You know, and a craftsman. And, you know, you don't have to like him, but you do have to respect him. You know, I like him as well, but I'm saying one doesn't have to like him, but one must respect his work and his body of work and his ability to survive and still have a smile on his face. Still be so positive, buoyant, you know. Every time I talk to Sydney, he's always upbeat. He met my father-in-law. In fact, when I ran into him for dinner a couple of weeks ago, and he was 100% engaged with him and just so happy to see him and to listen to whatever he had to say for that moment. And he said his piece, and Sydney was right there for him, and he was gone. You know, he's committed to each moment.
Yep.
Yep. Can't ask for more than that.
Can't ask for more than that.
No.
Thank you.
My pleasure.